Hello, everyone. My name is Elisa Ewan, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Teachers College. Thank you for joining us today for our Alumni Career Development webinar, which is co-sponsored by TC Next and Alumni Relations. It covers a range of career-related topics and features speakers from a variety of industries. This is one of the many ways you can stay engaged to your TC family. I'd like to quickly remind you of a few more ways you can maintain a meaningful connection with TC. 1. Hire TC alumni and students. 2. Refer prospective students back to the college. 3. Show your pride by including Teachers College in all of your professional credentials. 4. Share your talents and expertise by volunteering to speak at TC events or by joining one of our Alumni Association committees. And 5, when the time is right for you, support TC financially by donating to the TC Fund. We are especially grateful for the TC alumni who share their knowledge through insightful presentations, like the one we're about to hear, for all of the TC community to learn together. And now, I would like to introduce today's events presenter, alumna Gina Torino, who will be presenting Behind the Screen, Combating Microaggressions in the Workplace. Gina received her doctorate in counseling psychology from Teachers College, Columbia University in 2009. She has authored numerous scholarly articles, book chapters, and peer-reviewed studies on teaching strategies used to cultivate culturally competent clinicians, processes of white racial identity development, and the manifestation and impact of microaggressions. Her co-edited book, Microaggression Theory, Influence and Implication, with TC faculty member Dr. Daryl Wing Su, presents cutting-edge reviews of microaggression research, explores controversies surrounding the theory, discusses its relationship to the social-political dynamics of society, and offers solutions in combating microaggressions at the individual, institutional, and society levels. She is also a licensed psychologist in the state of New York. Gina will be taking questions from the audience during the latter part of our event, so please feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A pane below. We will be utilizing the chat and polling features during today's workshop, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We will be recording this webinar and you'll receive the recording in a follow-up email. If you have any technical or audio issues, please feel free to chat me and let me know how I can help. And without further ado, please help me welcome Gina Torino.
Well, thank you, Lisa, so much for the warm welcome. And thank you again for everything that you've done to make this happen. We are lucky to have you as a TC alumni. I speak for everybody. You've just done such great work here in the alumni office. So I want to thank you very much for putting this together and for all of the different workshops that you've put on. And as we start today, yes, I'm a proud TC alum, and as many of you are in this call, I have to say, I just want to say how grateful I am for the education that I received at TC up on the, if anyone knows, the counseling department on the 4th floor of Horace Mann. Spent many days, many late nights there, working hard with my mentor, Dr. Daryl Wing Su. Worked hard being a teaching assistant, Dr. Carter, Racial Cultural Lab. Maybe some of you have taken that class. And that's the class that really inspired me to do some work on myself as a racial cultural being and to recognize how much work I had to do. And I just want to thank all of my colleagues and mentors that have been with me this whole way. None of us get anywhere on our own, so we all have somebody to be grateful for. So I just wanted to mention that at the beginning of our session today. And thank you all for coming. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about microaggressions, particularly in the workplace and particularly some of the microaggressions we may have experienced online. Yeah, so now I graduated Found a job. I'm a full-time professor now at SUNY Empire State College, and here's a copy of my latest book that was co-edited with Dr. Sue and my colleagues who were been with me for many, many years. So I'm grateful to them as well. Right now, I just want to give you a little bit of what we're going to do here today. So here we have the outline. I'll give you some background and definitions, some examples of online microaggressions, the impact of microaggressions, and things that we can do to minimize and prevent the perpetration of microaggressions. I just have a quick poll. I think we have one here for you. So how many of you here in this audience are familiar with the term microaggressions? You have an opportunity to vote here. Yes, I know a lot about it. Yes, I know a little, but like to learn more. And no, I know nothing about it. So take a couple of seconds here and vote. Okay, okay. So, oh, I have the answers right here. This is great. So it seems like the majority of people, 63%, know little, would like to learn more. Some people know quite a bit, and some people don't know anything. So good. So a lot of people have some knowledge. So this is great. So we can really elevate the discussion here. So I'm going to move forward. Okay. So just a little bit of background here, in terms of what the evolution of race and racism in our country is. So, since the 1960s, discrimination has become illegal to overtly discriminate. So while blatant bias has diminished, racism kind of went below the radar a little bit. Instead of being so overt, racism became a little bit more covert. Then we started to see scholars explore different areas such as like symbolic racism, aversive racism. So people, are espousing egalitarian attitudes, non-racist attitudes, and yet at the same time, racism is still happening. So there seems to be maybe a disconnect between what people think and how they conceive themselves to be and how they're acting, right? So, and one concept related to this, and many people have become aware of this term, it's implicit bias, and it's also used interchangeably with the word unconscious bias. There's been kind of, those terms are used kind of back and forth. So implicit bias are the assumptions, stereotypes, and unintentional actions we make towards others, and typically they're based on different identity groups, such as race, age, religion, gender, and so on. And as I said before, oftentimes we can have thoughts of, okay, I'm not racist person, but then maybe act in a way that's racist, right? And we may not intend to, but we do anyway. And a lot of time these associations are stored in our unconscious. So we're not even aware of the implicit biases that we hold, but all of us have them, whether we're aware of them or not. And that's the part where it gets tricky, right? So then we come to microaggressions. So I just want to give you a little bit of background here on this term, microaggressions. In 1970, Chester Pierce coined the term. He did some research on African-American depictions in television commercials. And he kind of defined the term as like subtle, stunning, automatic, nonverbal exchanges, which are put downs, right? And so, other people such as Solorzano, he did some work with college students in the early 2000s. And in 2007, Dr. Sue and our research team, we came out with a piece entitled Racial Microaggressions in Everyday Life, Implications for Clinical Practice, in which we kind of fleshed out the term a little bit more. And we also created some categories and themes based on the literature that have already existed. So essentially what microaggressions are, they're derogatory slights or insults directed at a person or a group of people. And it's typically directed against marginalized people. And they can occur in various forms, either verbal or nonverbal or environmental. And oftentimes they do occur unconsciously. but they could be conscious, and they're often very subtle in nature. So I'm going to give you some examples of that, of what those might look like. So during our initial conceptualization, and if you want to look at additional themes, I have the references for you at the end of this presentation. You're welcome to look at the original piece that we wrote. So some of the themes that we created from the literature are ascription of intelligence. So by saying something to somebody like, you're so articulate, maybe you say that to a Black person, you're so articulate. It's unusual for a person of color or someone of your race to be so smart. So while the intention may have been to compliment that person, that's not the impact. That's not what the person is experiencing or hearing from you. And really the message that one could be sending is it's really unusual for somebody of your race to be so smart. I'm surprised by that. So while the perhaps original intention was to give someone a compliment, it's not received in that way. Another theme we had was color blindness. So when I look at you, I don't see race. And for many people, the adoption of a colorblind racial attitude was thought to be a good thing. You know, I don't see color. Everyone, we're all human beings. Yes, while that is true, uh, race does matter. Race matters in our lives. Every encounter we have is a racial encounter, whether we're aware of it or not. And so when you're saying to somebody, I don't see race, you may be trying to say it in a way that's conveying, well, I don't, we're not different, we're the same and we're equal. But then you're denying that person and her or his experience. Criminality or assumption of criminal status. So white man or woman clutching their purse or checking their wallet with a Black or Latinx person approaches or passes. And the theme is that the message is that you're dangerous, right? You're a dangerous person. So I need to kind of pull my bag a little bit closer. And so that's like a very subtle thing. So if I'm in an elevator and I go like this, and I just want to hold my bag a little tighter, what am I saying to that person, right? That one is dangerous. Some of the microaggressions, I know we're talking more about workplace microaggressions. Some scholars have done great research. Aisha Holder is the person who worked with us in our original piece, and she's done a lot of work around workplace microaggressions for African American women. And other researchers have done work with people from various racial ethnic groups. So one theme that's seen is invisibility. So this is kind of seen particularly for Asian American men and women, and for women in general. So an example of that would be a white person says in a meeting, we need racial diversity, and there's an Asian American person at the table, and that person is not seen as a person of color, or maybe just not even seen. They're invisible. That's one theme that's popped up. Stereotypes of Black women, for example, the angry Black woman stereotype. Assuming a Black colleague is angry when she speaks in a direct and assertive manner, that Black women are expected to be passive or docile, that a Black woman can't be assertive, because if she's too assertive, then she's angry, right? But if you're in a workplace and you're a person who's in an executive position, how are you expected to be? If one doesn't conform to the expectations, one can be marginalized in the workplace, or maybe even excluded from events at the workplace. Ascription of intelligence, so questioning someone's decision making, that Black women are not competent or can't make decisions. That's another theme that's emerged from the literature as well. So I think we might have a poll coming up here. And I'm interested to know and understand from the audience, how many of you have had experiences with microaggressions in the workplace, either in person or maybe online? Just take a second here. Getting the polls are coming in. Things are happening. Okay. Wow. So we've got quite a number of people, 81% said they have had these experiences. 1% not, and 17% unsure. And I think that's interesting, because that's one of the things that is really pernicious and insidious about microaggressions. Sometimes you don't know if they happen, and that's a part of the experience that is so difficult, I think, for so many people, is the uncertainty around it. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. um, with respect to, with COVID, as many people know and maybe have experienced, things are remote now, so we're no longer face to face. Although that will be changing for some people, not for everybody, but for some people. Microaggressions haven't disappeared just because we haven't had any chances to interact in person. They've just gone online, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And these biases can be communicated in different ways that we might not be aware of. So, for example, some of what's come out, and this is all pretty recent stuff because not everybody was working online in the same way that they have been over the last year or so. So one of the examples that is cited in literature is micromanaging some employees at a distance, or providing large amounts of structures and checking in, that somehow people need to be managed, that they can't handle it, or they're somehow questioning their work ethic. One of the things related to this as well is assuming that people have an office space or place to work in at home. Many people don't. There have been many instances where people have had to do meetings in a bathroom or something because they don't have the spaces to work in. So that's been a challenge as well. Uh, One of the things that people have done to kind of do these icebreakers during COVID is the assumption of impact or privilege. Doing a light, for example, like, give me some of the things you've done for fun. It's like, well, my experience hasn't really been fun because my grandfather has died of COVID or something like that. There are many people, particularly marginalized groups, who have experienced illness and death in their families. So presuming that people are having fun or doing things interesting is a real presumption of privilege. Mandating that all employees turn on their microphones and cameras during online meetings. Assumption of the home environment, so assuming that people don't have young children at home. And a lot of us do. We're trying to work, we're trying to manage our school and work, and we have kids at home, or we have an older parent at home, and we have noise in the background, and we can't always have our cameras on. And so it's really making assumptions about people's environments at home that have been very detrimental to people. When people show up, for example, that the woman shows up to an online meeting as a support staff member, assumption of role. This happens more so for women, in particular for Asian American women as well, like assuming the person is there to be the secretary or something like that, when that is not the case. That's happened many times to many people, and is found in the literature to be detrimental to a person's mental health. So for many of us, we have backgrounds, and some of us don't have backgrounds. And some people may be working in front of their bookshelf or in front of pictures. And you might say, what's that strange thing on your wall? And maybe it's something that's representing your culture. And you could inadvertently pathologize somebody's culture that way without knowing that you're doing so. So that's one to be careful of. Talking over, multitasking, or checking email while a person of color is speaking during an online meeting. It may seem, innocuous, right? But when you're doing that, you're sending the message to that person that what you're saying isn't important. I can tune you out. And this happens actually online and also in person at meetings. And this does happen quite a bit, where the person who is talking, whether it's a person of color or a woman, it's like saying to them, well, what you're saying isn't important, so I can tune you out. So it's sort of like a behavioral microaggression. Nothing that you're saying, but what you do is communicated to them as, what you're saying doesn't really matter. I don't have to listen to you. Saying to someone, wow, your hair looks a lot grayer now. Okay, maybe some people wouldn't say that, but some people might. Or you don't really look like, wow, you changed since you don't look anything like your picture. Some people put their pictures up and they don't look the same. You may be trying to just be funny, but that person may not think that that's a funny comment to make to them. So these are some of the online microaggressions that have been found in the literature that are occurring. And so I bring these to your attention just so you're mindful of your presence online. You're mindful of other people's experiences online as well. Okay. So I think we have something coming up here in the chat. We have a question that's going to be presented in terms of, you know, as indicated in the poll, many people have experienced microaggressions. And I'm interested to understand the challenges that some people have faced. And we can actually maybe talk a little bit about those challenges and maybe develop solutions around those challenges. So I think that's going to go into the chat, if I'm understanding this correctly. Okay. So I'm just going to continue here talking, and we're going to accumulate some of what you have to say in the chat area. And I just want to talk a little bit about, well, why are we even having this conversation? Why does any of this stuff matter? Who cares? These are just little things. Oh, who cares if I tune somebody out? Well, the thing about microaggressions is that they occur on a daily basis, and they do have an impact on people. So every day, people can get worn down by these experiences, and they could have a negative impact on the person. It's often described as like death by 1,000 cuts, right? One little cut's not going to matter, but many, many, many cuts over time will matter. Okay. One of the things we had touched upon earlier, and as some people indicated, is the ambiguity of microaggressions, maybe not even being sure. That is actually very difficult, because if a person's not sure, like, a person might be wondering, well, why didn't that person want to sit next to me in that meeting? Is it because I'm Black or not? I don't know. So you're kind of left not knowing, was that a microaggression, or did they just prefer to sit next to somebody? Well, maybe if it happens more than once over and over again, one is going to start to wonder, maybe this is because of my race, but maybe not. I don't know. And that's what really saps people's energy. Cognitive and emotional energy gets really sapped by the ambiguity of these microaggressions, which is why they could be so detrimental. And since 2007, really starting maybe more in 2010, a lot of research has been done, quantitative and qualitative research, discussing the impact of microaggressions. And there are many articles that you can find which indicate that there is a relationship between microaggressions and things like anxiety, depression, race-based traumatic stress. So people experiencing symptoms analogous to PTSD, such as like having trouble sleeping, hypervigilance, always wanting to kind of check who's around you. These are very difficult experiences that people are having as the result of race-based trauma from microaggressions. Some negative health outcomes. There's actually some newer research now discussing the relationship between microaggressions and cortisol levels and stress, and even suicidal ideation. So when people say these microaggressions are small and don't really matter, well, they do matter. And now the research is starting to indicate that, I think, which is very powerful and will hopefully change people's minds on microaggressions, because there's a bit of a backlash, I would say, in the larger socio-political culture against the incidence and impact of microaggressions. And with respect to workplace impact, it's been found that people who experience microaggressions have a decrease in job satisfaction, lower organizational commitment, negative impact on job performance, and higher rates of attrition. So, right, are you going to work as hard? Are you going to feel safe working in your environment if you're continuously being questioned, if you're constantly being looked over, if your work isn't being perceived as good enough? It's going to make you feel bad about your work environment. If you're constantly being asked to represent one's group, for example, in a meeting, it's gonna really wear a person down, and over time, people just end up leaving their jobs, unfortunately, because of microaggression, and that's not okay. Much like I think, as we're all familiar with sexual harassment, that's a term that people know about. People didn't always know that term. So back in the 60s, if you're a woman and you actually complained about things in your workplace, oh, don't worry, sweetie, you're fine. Well, it's not fine. And I think racial harassment is going to become more prevalent now, particularly in workplace settings. So this is a real issue for all of us to be aware of. Okay. So we're looking here, what can be done? What can we do about this? That's what people always want to say. Well, okay, Gina, this is great. So you've described everything for us. We know what's happening. What can we do about it? And this is really, really important. So I think at the organization, many things we could do, and we're going to discuss them here now. And then also, Elisa has some handouts for you at the end of this presentation that you can take back to your workplace and take back to yourself in your own life. So at the organization level, be intentional in planning the virtual workplace. So really think about what the virtual workplace means for all of employees and take any feedback that you might get from people into account. Build in some flexibility, in terms of scheduling, in terms of where people can work, in terms of how they can work, and try to really understand the unique challenges of workers within your organization. You can assess the microaggressions within the organization. I've worked with this company called Inchorus, and they actually have developed a tool to assess at the organization level, what types of microaggressions are occurring in the workplace, who's experiencing them, how do they manifest, and also provide recommendations on what people can do in the workplace to mitigate them. Engage in active learning and decrease bias. Offer lots of training to your employees in the organization. One thing that people can do, and you can even do this on your own. If people haven't done this before, I highly recommend looking at the implicit association test by Harvard. It kind of taps into your implicit biases that you may have. I often give this to students in classes when I teach, and they're often surprised. They're like, wow, I didn't realize I had these biases. And some of them resist it, some of them take it in. So it just depends on where they are in their learning. Another thing at the organization level is to really offer support and mentorship. Within the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, within employee resource groups, offer a buddy system. People need a place where they can go and just process and say, look, this is what happened to me. I really need to talk about this. This could be a problem. And just a place where people can go and get support, because again, experiencing these microaggressions on a daily basis can take a real toll, psychological toll on people. So they need a place to go to, which is really important. Okay. Recently, my my former mentor, Dr. Geraldine Su, and colleagues came out with a new book on micro-intervention strategies. And a lot of these strategies have been used. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that people can do on the individual level to combat racism and bias, and particularly microaggressions. So make the invisible visible, disarming the microaggression, educating the perpetrator, and seeking outside support. So I'm going to go through these individually right now. Okay. So, as we've been talking, sometimes microaggressions are not seen. They're not really understood. So one of the things that one could do in terms of meeting the microaggression head on is to make the invisible visible. So bring the microaggression that's committed to the forefront of the person's awareness, right? Indicate to the person who did it that they have done something offensive. And again, if somebody experiences a microaggression, they could do these things. And again, I think people have to be mindful of the context in terms of these interventions, like where are they doing it? Who are they saying this to? What could be the implications of saying these things to people, particularly if there is a hierarchy? So you want to be mindful, and yet at the same time, as a leader, if people in this audience and are managers or leaders, they need to be mindful of these interventions and practice them in front of their employees to show their commitment to diminishing microaggressions in their workplace. So to develop some perspective here and say, can you see what's happening? Like point out the microaggression that's occurred. Disempower it by naming it, saying that's a microaggression, and perhaps undermine the meta communication. So a microaggression against Asian Americans, or that, the stereotype that Asian Americans are good at math, and maybe you ask the Asian American person in your office to help you with the math problem that you're having. Well, not all Asian Americans are good at math, and just by saying that, making the invisible visible. Okay, that's one way. Another way is to disarm the microaggression. Okay, so you're going to somehow stop it or deflect it in some way and communicate disagreement or disapproval towards the perpetrator. Another thing I want to say too is people may actually witness microaggressions happening to people. It's important that if you're witnessing a microaggression and you want to speak up, that you speak with the person and not for the person, because the person can speak for themselves. So just to be mindful of that, in terms of who you're with, the relationship you have with them, and not to speak for someone, but with somebody. So you want to affirm and validate that person, and say, you have my support. Another thing you could do is say something like, ouch, or like, oh, ow, ooh, that hurt. Something like that. Or express your reaction non-verbally, like shake your head or be like, somehow create this nonverbal disagreement and disarm the microaggression right in the while it's happening. Educate the perpetrator. One of the biggest issues is intent and impact. Again, we may be trying to compliment somebody. We may be asking them, where are you from? Seems like an innocent question, but asking that question to an Asian American person, for example, who's from the United States, and tells you that, and then you continue to ask it, well, they've told you where they're from. So the difference between intent and impact, you may have meant well, but that really hurt me. Continuing to, for example, question where I'm from makes me feel like an outsider, right? So that's an important issue. Appeal to the offender's values. I know you care about everyone on the team, but your actions undermine your attempt to be inclusive, right? So you want to kind of say, we know that you care, but this is what's really happening. So maybe pointing that out to them would be helpful. Revisiting the incident later. I want to talk about what happened yesterday. So sometimes, while we like to meet things, head on and deal with them in the moment, we may not be able to think, or we might be so like stunned or, bowled over by what happened. You can always come back to it and revisit it at some point. You can always do that. Okay. And you have to take care of yourself. Everyone needs to take care of themselves in these situations, and demonstrate that this behavior is not going to be tolerated, and hold the leaders in your organization accountable. We all need to be accountable, and people in the organization, particularly at the higher levels, need to especially be accountable. Some of the things you could do is to alert leadership, speak to a manager or someone in authority, someone in HR. If this is an ongoing issue for you and you're experiencing it and nothing's getting done, you have to go to a higher level. Seek therapy or counseling. Sometimes we need help getting through some of these issues that are happening to us, and that's okay. Develop a buddy system, process incidents with trusted colleagues or trusted friends. That's a really important tool to use as well. For people in the audience, including myself, who have perpetrated microaggressions, when you do it, and if somebody confronts you, really the biggest issue is to not get defensive. I think, we all like to think of ourselves as being good people and not biased. But as I said before, I believe we all have biases in some way. So try not to get defensive. The immediate say, well, I didn't mean that. That wasn't me. Just take a breath, take stock of your thoughts and feelings, and ask the person to help you understand the microaggression. Well, boy, can you help me understand this? Because I really didn't mean that. So please tell me more about that. How is that a microaggression? And really take that in and don't get defensive. And it's important to acknowledge that you hurt somebody. It really can go a long way if you really mean it and you're genuine and authentic. I think that that's a big part in conveying to somebody your desire to learn, because we all have things to learn. And if we admit that and are able to stick with the discomfort that we're feeling, that's important. Then you could potentially avoid similar instances in the future, and take some responsibility for yourself to increase your own understanding of your biases and privileges. None of us particularly like to admit those things about ourselves, but as a white person, for example, I have to understand what that means for me in my life and at work, and the impact that it has on people. So that's on me to understand, not on anybody else. And I'm responsible for my own biases and how they may impact other people. That's my responsibility, not anybody else's. Um, so that's important. Oh, so here we are at the end. So I have many references here for you. And as Elisa said, this will be recorded. And so thank you again for coming. I think we do have some questions here. And I'm happy to sit here and talk to you to the end of our program here until 4 o'clock. So thank you so much.
Gina, thank you so much for going through, giving us the background about microaggressions and giving us like so many helpful examples.
Okay.
So I really appreciate that. Everyone who's still on the call, if you have any questions for Gina, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A pane, which is located at the bottom of your screen. So Gina, we have some questions that have rolled in. So if you're ready, we'll go
Yeah.
ahead and start.
Yeah.
So one of in your presentation, you gave so many really amazing examples of microaggressions. And I think one of them, made a lot of people in the audience, including myself, kind of step back because we didn't realize, oh, that can be considered a microaggression. And it was your example about multitasking
Mm.
in online
Yeah.
meetings.
Yeah.
Because I know
Yeah.
with so many of us, if we have, back to back to back meetings, the only time we can actually do work is during the meeting because that's the only time we have left.
Yeah.
But of course, that could be considered a microaggression.
Mhm.
So we have a couple of people wondering if the person who's speaking is not a person of color, is it still considered a microaggression if you're multitasking
Mm.
online? And if and then the second question is, because it can be considered a microaggression, we want to make sure that the person doesn't feel like we're not paying attention to them. It's just we are trying to get the work done. So how do we manage how people might take that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important question, and typically, I mean, with respect to delivering microaggressions, people who experience microaggressions, we can all experience them in different ways, but the impact may be different. So, if you're a member of a person from a marginalized group, again, whether that's with respect to race, age, ethnic group, ability, and definitely there's an intersectionality, race and gender, race and ability, race and LGBT. It depends on who's speaking and who that person is. And it could be considered a microaggression, definitely to multitask, even though we are busy. We could inadvertently tune somebody out without knowing it, and if you become more mindful of when and how you're multitasking in each situation, um, you could become maybe more conscious of a pattern. Say, am I doing this when a person of color is speaking, or am I doing this all the time? So it's really important, I think, to be mindful of who is speaking and what you're doing and how you're doing it. And I think we all, just in general, just to be respectful of each other. I mean, we all want to be included. Nobody wants to feel excluded. So as much as possible to minimize that multitasking. Who wants to talk to somebody who's looking down and who's doing other things? You're not getting that person's full attention. So if that happens a lot to people over time, it could have a detrimental impact on um, you know, their view of their input into an organization. So that's what I would say to that.
Well, thank you. I think that was extremely eye-opening for everyone on the call. It was definitely eye-opening for me. So I really appreciate your answer to that.
Hmm.
So the next question we have, you were just mentioning how, microaggressions are usually towards marginalized groups,
Hmm.
depending on gender, ethnicity, and things like
Hmm.
that. When you're
Yeah.
in a workplace where the minority group, for example, females make up the majority in the organization, does the focus of the microaggression consider that change, or how does that work when the minority becomes the majority in an organization?
Well, I think, while it may change within an organization, what is the kind of overall society think of that person? So, for example, if you're in a majority female institution, but women are still working in the context of a patriarchal system as the cultural kind of dominant system. So, just to consider that, I think is important. So while it may be different in your organization, consider the cultural context, I would say.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that answer. So earlier you were giving us, tips and advice of, how to address microaggressions when we witness it. So we have a couple of people on the call wondering, ex- like, when you witness a microaggression, is it best to kind of address that microaggression in front of the group or address it privately, specifically when it happens virtually, like, on Zoom or something? What's the best way to address that?
Well, I mean, if it can be addressed in that moment, especially if you're the leader of the group and you see this happen in the moment, it's okay to meet it head on, do it right there, and you're not doing it to shame somebody or to make them feel bad. It's to really demonstrate to everybody that this type of behavior needs to be addressed in the moment, and this is how we're going to do it in this organization. And so even maybe having some kind of understanding of, first of all, if people don't know or understand what microaggressions are within an organization, they may be flummoxed or taken aback by, well, what is this person doing? I don't even know what they're talking about. So it's really important that from the top down that microaggressions are understood, so everybody has the same vernacular, same understanding of what they are, same understanding of the impact they can have. So I would say, that would be something that would be necessary, and then say, well, this is the framework we have for our organization, and this is how we're going to handle it, so that people aren't shocked, when they experience them, they actually perhaps perpetrate a microaggression and are addressed in that moment. That would be really the best way to handle it. However, it could be handled later too. If it doesn't happen in that moment, it doesn't have to be lost opportunity. But of course, we don't want to we don't want to shame people. And yet at the same time, we don't want things to just keep going on and on and on and not addressing them.
That leads me to a question I've seen pop up a lot in the Q&A, is talking about training. I mean, not all organizations are, when onboard new employees, or, when you implement in training for all employees,
Yeah.
microaggression and racial harassment is not always included.
Yeah.
So how can we bring this up to, people of power, to make sure that this training becomes mandatory and it's the same as any compliance training, just to make sure, like you had mentioned earlier in your answer, that when you tell someone, oh, that was a microaggression, they're not completely taken back and have no idea what that means.
Yeah,
So do you have any advice on how to bring that up?
well, I think you're bringing up an important issue, and a very important issue actually, because Yeah, I think for employees who do experience microaggressions and maybe there is not this understanding, is there an office at your workplace that deals with diversity, equity, inclusion? If so, great. If not, that may be something to bring up to your supervisor, to your manager, to a representative in HR, and maybe getting other people with you saying, I've talked to 10 people here and we believe that this is important and we want to bring this to your attention. If you have the numbers behind you, that could be helpful so people may listen. If not, there could be real detrimental impacts. And I'll share with the group. I'm actually working as an expert witness right now on a case in which a person, ended up leaving an organization because of the microaggressions, is now suing this big international company, which I won't name, because of her experiences, and they didn't listen to her. So now there's a huge lawsuit against this organization, and unfortunately, it had to go that way for this person. She wasn't able to get her needs met in the organization, and this is what's happening. So these are really really important issues to people's lives, like serious transformational issues that could have negative in a negative way, really negative. The organization, if the organization doesn't transform into something that is sensitive to the needs of people with respect to race, it could be a real big problem for them, and it is.
Thank you so much for that answer. I really appreciate it. And I know everyone else on the call really appreciates it as well.
Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned, being conscious and noticing patterns in our speech and behavior as it relates to microaggressions. How do you develop this additional self-awareness to be respectful of, the various marginalized groups, so you're constantly, being aware of the words and your actions and how that might impact someone, both
Yeah.
positively and negatively?
Yeah, I mean, there are consciousness raising groups, organizations that are out there. There's a center, I think it's for white American culture. They provide workshops. There are things called courageous conversations. They occur if you look that up online. There are opportunities there. Again, I think it's important to really focus on it. It's like a change in the way you think and behave, but it's not like counting every single word or saying, well, I can't say this and I can say this. It's sort of developing like an inner kind of and I'm just going to focus on race in particular. That happens to be my area of expertise. So just developing like an anti-racist kind of attitude and way of being. So that's really infused in everything that you say and do. And everything that you say and do is not going to be perfect. And you just have to accept that. It's sort of like, the therapeutic process. You're an imperfect being, and we're aware of that. It's how you respond to being an imperfect being. So maybe you do say something to somebody that it may be offensive, or after this call, you might say to a colleague at work, "Oh, yo, I love your hair. Can I touch your hair?" Saying that to a black woman. All right, well, maybe that person might say, "Hey, look, that's not okay," and you're like, "Oh, okay, I understand." So you kind of recognize that maybe what you did wasn't the best thing, that it was offensive to that person, and you maybe were objectifying them in some way. That's going to happen, but you're going to learn from that experience. So taking responsibility, joining organizations, talking to your friends, being open to what you don't know with other people is key too, because you don't know everything. I don't know everything. I'm always learning too, even though I'm this expert. I hope that I'm always learning. And so that's it's sort of like an attitude shift, rather than getting to know everything. It's impossible to know everything.
No, completely agree. And I mean, and I think that's something that we see a lot with, TC graduates and TC alumni and the TC community is like we're lifelong learners. We're constantly
Yeah.
wanting to, you know, be part of listening circles, really understand because, a lot of the microaggressions is really is how you self-identify, and that's how it might be perceived in a microaggression, setting. And so being part of these listening and constantly learning is such important. So, and that's why we're just so glad that you're here today
Yeah.
to kind of talk more about it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the next questions we have is really focusing on the LGBTQIA, community. I mean, have we seen, more and more organizations were mentioning our pronouns and things like that, but
Mm,
that's not a common practice across the board. So how do we deal with microaggressions regarding misgendering someone?
yeah.
I mean, it happens all the time, and if pronouns aren't listed,
Sure.
it becomes like an awkward situation. So
Yeah.
what's the best way to handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, with respect to organizational commitment, that has to be there as well. If people include, so for example, one of the tools that I mentioned early on, the in chorus, it kind of goes through the types of microaggressions that are perpetrated in an organization. And if that is something that's of issue, then that would need to be addressed in that particular organization. So having awareness built around pronouns is important through training, through providing resources. Some people use that on their email, their pronoun preference. That's also something that's done, but that has to occur, at the top and be something that's valued. And bringing it to the attention of people who can do something about it is really key. Um, so I think that that's an important piece. um One of the, I'm looking here also in the chat. Can I address some of these issues too that are
Of
happening?
course, please
Yeah.
do.
you know uh Somebody said, I think there were a couple in there, said something about the question, like, where are you from? And you're genuinely asking that to somebody because you're curious, and or you want to start a conversation with them, or you want to get to know them. And I think that there's nothing inherently wrong with that question. It's asking it again after they share it with you. So you might say, oh, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Brooklyn. No, well, where are you really from? Well, I'm from Brooklyn. Like, if you continue to add, no, where are you really, really from? I'm from Brooklyn. Like, if you, I'm not from anywhere else. That's what it's the asking again and again, the kind of disbelief that a person who says they're from, for example, the United States, and maybe they're a person of color, and you're like, but you're really from somewhere else. Well, no, I'm not really. I'm really from Brooklyn. And just take that. That's your answer. And don't keep pressing it. As I think sometimes that people, like, well, I really just want to get to know somebody. That's fine. Of course, you want to get to know people, but again and again and again, that's where that question, I think, becomes an issue. And I see another person, asked, how do you address a friend or colleague that doesn't believe in microaggressions? And I think that this is an interesting question, because there is a backlash. People, there are many, and there are people in the media who say, what's wrong with these social justice warriors? They're just too sensitive, and the issue is that maybe other people aren't sensitive enough. There's research here indicating that microaggressions have a detrimental impact on mental health. So how do you understand that? So a person maybe who doesn't believe in microaggressions, doesn't believe that they exist. Well, they do exist. And you can point them to some literature maybe that they're not aware of. There are now books. There are many research articles. So any kind of evidence, because sometimes people don't respond to, unfortunately, a person's experience, and that's part of the problem. It's like, well, sharing your experience is enough. Where's the data? Well, now we have data. There's actual data there to support these claims. So maybe pointing them in that direction, that could help.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your answer, about the where are you from question, because that's, I mean, I know I get that a lot because
Yeah.
and they're always so surprised when I say from Mississippi, which I completely understand. But then they just keep pressing. I'm like, the answer is not going to change every time you ask. So like, I don't know why you keep asking. Like,
Yeah.
maybe reframe the question then, because apparently what you're trying to ask is
Right.
not the answer you want.
Yeah.
But I just looked at time, and
Mm.
unfortunately we're out of time. I thank you everyone who submitted questions. I'm so sorry if we weren't able to get to your question, but Gina has generously provided her contact information, which is on the screen in front of you. Feel free to reach out to her directly if we didn't get to your question or if you have a question for her.
Yes,
You know, Gina, thank you so much for taking the time
of course.
to go through and make sure we have a really deep and rich understanding about microaggressions and giving us all these examples and tips and advice on how to address it and combat it, especially in a virtual setting, because I know this is something that so many of us are struggling with. So I truly appreciate you taking the time to be here with the TC community and giving us all this information. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to share with people. And yes, if you like to email me, feel free to email me and I can help in any way that I can. So thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Thank you. And every audience members, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for our TC Alumni Career Development webinar. We hope that you'll stay tuned to our emails and social media for details on future events, including promoting sustainable futures in our communities with alumni panelists Thomas Chandler and Jamie Macbeth, along with Rashka Vasudevan, moderated by TC faculty member Orem Pismoni Levy on June 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sharing the recording of this event as well as some handouts in a post-event email. We hope to see you at future TC alumni events. Until then, thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.